Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about the heap of discipline changes, the impact that it has on the spec, in addition to all of the changes to health increases, damage increases, and everything on Dragonflight Beta. We'll also talk a little bit as well about some of the holy changes in passing as at another point in this video, so be sure to check out the chapters as I'll give the lowdown on everything going on as of late. But first, let's start it off as well with Disc. There has been a heap of changes, nerfs, buffs, all kinds of things going on. So one of the biggest concerns that I had with tuning for Discipline is that it was obvious throughout our previous raid testing that the spec was incredibly powerful, and we were anticipating that there was going to be some nerfs, and that whenever they would nerf Discipline in beta, from Shadowlands beta and before that in BFA beta, they often did these flat nerfs to Atonement's transfer rate, and it did end up balancing the spec for a raiding environment, but it always seemed to kill off the spec in a 5-man environment. Today, and I also mentioned it in prior videos, but in this video, they finally have made changes that added an independent variable to be able to tune Discipline's damage and atonement, two different things, damage and atonement, for a 5-man, and then their damage and atonement for a raid. So with this, we do have a flat buff to atone, or sorry, a flat nerf to atonement from 50% of damage done to 40%. They have reverted the evangelism change, which is wonderful for our gameplay, which we'll also be talking about our raid testing gameplay, in addition to our M+ gameplay as well. They buffed this talent, Malicious Intent, for more duration on Schism, which I'm very indifferent on. And they did revert the nerf towards the atonement duration that you are granted from Powered Radiance. So very, very big from a rating perspective for the atonement duration on Radiance and from the evangelism cooldown. This, once again, widens our ramp windows, makes us not as vulnerable, of course, to incoming damage, incoming hits, things along those lines, and really smooths things out, makes life a lot easier. So huge ups for reverting these nerfs. That helps massively. But in exchange, we do have the nerfs to overall atonement, as well as a nerf to Schism, now increasing your damage by 15% instead of 25% on that target. That being said, though, Sins of the Many is no longer a talent and is now a baseline ability. With this, your damage is increased by 30%, but it only begins to diminish on the 6th atonement applied. Usually how Sins of the Many worked was that it would diminish starting at 1. And so by the time you had 4 or 5 atonements out, you only had like a 7-8% damage increase with the old build. Now with the new build, you're maintaining a flat 30% damage buff until you hit 6 atonements. I believe Focus Will did the math, and pretty sure it's like a 1 or 2% damage gain at like 18 to 20 atonements, so a little bit less than that 3% hard cap that it used to be, but it's also a baseline ability that we have on now. And to replace it, there's a 2-pointer from the PvP talents, which is Blaze of Light. You see on the right side of your screen, the damage of your Smite and Penance is increased by 8% for the first node, and then 15% for the second node. Just boom, flat. More Smite and Penance damage. Lovely. We absolutely love that. Now, the change that is not listed here is one that is intended to come in for Harsh Discipline. We'll talk about all of these talents that you see on your screen in a moment, a little bit later on, but the current version of Harsh Discipline is after you've healed for Atonement for 100 times, your next penance is free and fires 3 additional bolts. Their intended new version of this is supposed to be one where you're going to have that free extra 3 bolts for penance and everything like that after you cast 5 smites. Now, it has not been added in any of the footage that you're about to see. It's not been added to the beta just yet, but I did want to talk about this change because it's the only one not implemented, and to me, it sounds like this might be an opportunity for something to change. Now, having to activate 5 smites to be able to produce atonement healing, additional atonement healing out of penance is really not great. As it stands with Harsh Discipline at the moment, and again, we don't know what the new version is going to look like, you'd have a very brief window of about 15 seconds when Harsh Discipline procs to spend it, which usually is never a problem in this Atonement healing form, but in one that requires smite activators, this could be very, very bad. As a result of this, you might have to do some very awkward stuff where you're tracking a weak aura to see how many times that you've hit smite before you even begin your ramp, so that you can apply all your atonements, extend their duration, cast a smite, then cast Schism, then all your other abilities, blah, blah, blah. Just that you could guarantee force proc Harsh Discipline at specific times. And it just adds this extra layer of like annoyance and complexity, which Disc does not need, for one. Whereas with the old form of Harsh Discipline, yeah, as you're applying all of your atonements, you're almost certainly going to have Harsh Discipline proc, because you're constantly cycling from proc to proc to proc once you build it up to begin with. Now, this one isn't perfect. It also de-emphasizes using things like contrition, whereas I guess maybe the other version would kind of encourage it. I don't know. But as it stands, that smite activator is quite bad for raids and just annoying to deal with. And in a key environment, you're not really just like sitting there casting smite unless it's one of the like garbage can bosses that doesn't really do anything. It's like forcing those penance procs is just not so good. And again, we'll go back to these talents just in a little bit. Overall, these changes are extremely, extremely nice for Disc in general. They do give that long sought after independent variable. And so the practical application of what has happened, real brass tacks on it, what's gone on. Your raid healing has been brought down a bit. You're a bit more in line with everybody else. We did 2 raid bosses. It was the Primal Council and it was Grim Totem. We overhealed both fights with like 6 healers, which is, you know, pretty par for the course for beta testing. But I did see some guilds were fort healing it and really pushing the limits of what was possible. That being said, Disc was still owning when it came to one of the encounters, the Primal Council. The other one with Grim Totem, I think, was a bit harder to be able to properly time my ramps, so it didn't feel as strong. But the spec itself, you know, my gameplay aside, the spec itself, I think, is in a very powerful position for the incoming raid. There's a lot of opportunities to be able to put together powerful ramps, and there's also a lot of steady damage that's going out. So the real sequence that I was running with was one where you would have Rapture application to put together a Light's Wrath ramp. Then you'd have a free Radiance charge before you would begin your next ramp with Evangelism. And so you were kind of able to bounce back and forth as long as the damage was there. And it seemed to work pretty well for Primal Council with no add-ons or timers or anything like that to be able to tell you what to do. Thankfully, I had my weak auras to track some of my abilities. But definitely, as we get more refined with our timers, the spec is only going to be improving. And if this is the end of the nerfs for Disc in a raid environment, they are in very good shape. Disc also boasts some insane damage for healers, insane passive damage for healers, way better than everybody else, which is also part of the reason why they nerfed down Crystalline Reflection. Even though it's not listed in these Wowhead notes, they did nerf some of the damage that is contributed from Crystalline Reflection. Although, that damage does not convert into any Atonement healing, so we don't really have to worry at all about any of that stuff for healing perspective. In a Mythic Plus environment, this Sins of the Many change is a very, very large damage buff, which was much needed for the spec, and it results in almost exactly the same amount of healing that you could really expect out of Atonement. We'll have some different sections to talk about the gameplay between raids and M+ as well in the chapters, but overall, super thrilled to see where Disc is now getting brought up in the damage that it's contributing, even though I don't think healer damage is like the most important factor going into Dragonflight M+, the way it was in a lot of Shadowlands M+. It still is nice to make sure that you are competing with your peers and not kind of lagging behind like some other non-priest specs are at the moment. Now that we've had a chance to talk about the overview, I wanted to dig into really what's been going on with the specs. On your screen right now, we have the talents. Try not to read into too much of the class stuff because there is some decent variety of when you can drop Holy Nova talents and stuff like that, so don't worry about the class talents too much. I really want to focus in on your spec talents and some of the builds that I was running for the raid testing before I show you the footage on this one. For this, I was messing around with Make Amends, and while I thought it was going to be a nice bit of extra atonement onto myself, it really wasn't that impactful. It wasn't that big of a deal. I also was messing around with Protective Light, which had some okay uptime, especially when it's mostly free, because whenever I'm applying atonements and building up my ramps, you almost always have a Surge of Light proc to be able to spend, and if you don't, it's still really efficient to be able to cast one flash heal, and then Binding Heals will apply Atonement to yourself in addition to your target, so you get 2 atonements basically for the price of 1. Overall, that felt pretty good and was very easy to mix in. I do think some things like Tithe Evasion, I don't know if I've talked about it in other videos, but when you do get into execute phase, almost completely nullifying the blowback damage is really valuable, and it allows you to sort of just double tap Death and Madness for the double Shadow or Death with Abandon, and feels quite good. That being said, I don't really see much value out of things like Malicious Intent. Overall, most of the time, you don't have gobs and gobs of Atonement duration as is. Maybe you could get some extra value out of like the second Penance cast or something along those lines if you're able to have enough Atonements up. But again, that's like once every minute and a half where you could maybe net out a bit more damage. But then they also nerfed the value out of Schism, so it's a 15% damage buff instead of 25. So it seems like kind of an extra talent point in Make Amends that you could float around as needed, but not something that felt particularly great. Mind Games was nerfed in a build about a week ago, and it still feels very, very poor. Some of the other changes were to nerf down Light's Wrath's growth damage. Instead of 10% per ally, it's now 6% per ally. They did, however, buff the baseline damage of Light's Wrath to make it better, presumably in a 5-man, but that felt bad too, and we'll talk about that in the 5-man setup. But this is around what I was running with for our raid testing. Twilight Equilibrium, unfortunately, still has a number of bugs due to spell weaving and spell clipping, or spell queuing, excuse me, where sometimes casting certain abilities just gets rid of the buff, and you don't always have the buff on hand all the time. But conceivably, if it is working properly, you should be able to carry a 15% damage buff through most of your ramp windows without too much issue whatsoever. I did still talent into Mind Games, even though it was pretty cruddy. You could put points into Stolen Psyche to have Mind Blast's damage convert into more Atonement healing than you would get out of Mind Games, but it's also just like some extra investment I guess you could take from something like Make Amends and maybe somewhere else along the tree, but it didn't seem like a very pressing priority for me as I was doing the testing. Harsh Discipline, as always, carried, felt great, loved to play with it. Divine Aegis had also been nerfed in a prior build for a bit less of a shielding value, and it felt a bit more noticeable that it's just a bit of extra support and it's a bit of extra shielding that you're going to be able to have on hand. So I have actually been considering what if you're moving some of these points from DA into some of the other options, but nothing really screams out at me, nothing really jumps out at me as like, this is super great and this is super OP. So you might see some decent variety of people shying away from Divine Aegis and going towards, I don't know, maybe Resplendent, maybe Expiation, even though it's pretty damn costly for your mana. If there is decent opportunity to be able to hit targets and get additional Shadow or Death value, that could be very big, but your mana economy doesn't really have the capabilities to sustain pressing Mind Blast that often, and the more that you're eating up your dots, the more you have to refresh them, the more you have to spend extra mana to be able to maintain them. And even with an Innervate, I could feel my mana getting a bit stretched, and I had to be very conscious of when I was using Renew for my ramps because it's extremely, extremely costly. I didn't mess around with too much of Wheel and Woe, and it'll be basically dependent in a raid environment on how like Harsh Discipline's going to play out going forward, but there is the potential, especially for like the bonus shield value, especially because it works with your 4-piece of increasing the shield strength, that I guess possibly that could be something on hand. I did, however, like it in keys, and we'll talk about that when we get into the key session. Aegis of Wrath did result in like 2 or 3% extra healing when I plugged it into WoW Analyzer from my own logs and experience, but some of the fights are going to have downtime before the damage actually happens. I was using it on like Primal Council, for example, which has like lots and lots of steady damage, so my shields were always getting consumed. But when we actually timed it, it takes about 6 or 7 seconds for the decay of Aegis of Wrath to bring that shield back to the sub 30% to cancel out the buff that is given from Aegis. So if you do have quite a bit of downtime where your shields are not properly getting consumed, it might just be a waste of a talent point to be able to go after something like Aegis when it comes to like a raid environment. So that's always something that I would recommend you kind of keep in mind. And WoWanalyzer.com is always tracking that benefit. So when you get to play with it yourself, I'd highly recommend it. As I mentioned previously, I went through the Primal Council fight and also the Grim Totem fight, and there was quite a lot of healing required, even though we did have a lot of our healers in. We had all of our healers on the roster and everything like that in to test with us. Primal Council was pretty interesting because it was, I think, very well suited to the sort of go, go, go style that Discipline has. I think a lot of people have been worried about Disc in Dragonflight as having so much downtime. Like, what am I going to do? It's almost like Sanctum of Domination again, where I'm just going to blow my load and then sit around for a few minutes. And that is very much not true anymore. With talents like Bright Pupil that are reducing the cooldown of Powered Radiance, with the extreme value that you get out of Power Word Shield, to want to be utilizing it on cooldown, you are so active and have so many opportunities to continue healing and continue producing output in meaningful ways, even when you're not having your ramp windows coming around. I noticed in particular a very go play style when it came to Primal Council, that I was able to build up lots of atonements, be able to cover one of the lightning mechanics or one of the frost and fire mechanics very quickly, very easily, and then choose whether I needed to flex into a little bit more healing with an extra radiance charge or two, or whether I wanted to cool down, save mana, maintain dots, and just add extra damage as a healer, because like I mentioned prior in the overview, that you are contributing a very large amount of damage, such to the fact that I don't exactly know what they're going to do to be able to balance that out when it comes to raiding, because your raid damage is head and shoulders above the other healers at the moment, just passively without having to really worry about anything else. And you're kind of like middle of the pack. You're with the group when it comes to M+ damage. So if you hit one, you're gonna have to hit another, obviously. So I'm curious to see how that one is going to work out. But I'm very pleased with how much flat damage contribution that the spec is being able to have in the raid, and it feels very good. From the mobility, from like the mechanics on a number of these fights, it does seem like you're able to very quickly get the timers that you need. You can put together 45-second ramps pretty quickly and easily by splitting Rapture and Evangelism as needed. If there are some fights where you're going to trade off focus, you potentially could stack some ramps together if there was that much of a need. But I didn't think it was something that was overly necessary, because it seemed like the encounters that we've gone through on beta have been tuned down quite a bit more than some of the other ones we've seen from raid testing. Sanctum of Domination was really notable for only having 1 or 2 boss fights when we did PTR testing on it that actually did much damage. I think Guardian of the First Ones was probably the only one, I think, that came to mind that actually did lots and lots of damage. So this Vault of the Incarnates testing felt a lot easier. I could stand in fire and just kind of add extra healing or something like that and not have to worry about getting killed. Some of the fire puddles and everything, people could like double or triple clear, and we had tons of space and tons of room to be able to work with. The Grim Totem fight, usually we were just kind of dying to mechanics, and it wasn't really the tuning that was too crazy heavy on that one. It was more of just our own mechanical failures that would end up kind of overwhelming us. So overall, I don't think that these fights are crazy pushing us in a testing format, but I do think that once we actually get ourselves into the actual raid environment, that all of that overheal, all of that extra fluff is going to go away. For my own testing, I was doing like 40% overhealing or something like that with a lot of my Atonement healing, again, because we were bringing lots of healers. But once we properly get into that format, once we properly get into the live servers and live events, I definitely foresee that ability for Dis to completely cover mechanics as needed, allow other healers to just use filler, and not expend overly large amounts of mana while you're able to pump out just gobs and gobs of healing. I think utilizing Renew and Flash Heal has to be very limited based off of how much Atonement expenditure we have going on right now. But if you can do that, if you can have a decent mana economy going, the Evoker Empower stuff is like okay extra mana. But obviously, having an Innervate, having more Druid specs on hand that can provide you an Innervate, will make sure that you're good to go. There's also a number of consumables that are very OP. There's a specific potion that'll also make certain abilities free, kind of like what we had as well in Shadowlands. So they have a couple different like flavor potions that I don't know if they're going to keep on hand going forward. So TBD on that one. But overall, Disc is looking great despite those nerfs. We got to test right as they nerfed Atonement overall. We got to test with the additional damage, with the additional health pools. Light's Wrath doesn't feel like I'm chunking everybody up in health anymore, but it still does feel noticeably powerful. And I'd say the biggest issues facing Disc in a raid environment right now are probably just some of the ones around finding the right timers for some of the ramps, finding what to do with some of those extra talent point nodes, and again, just timings. Getting used to the timings, getting used to the movement, because there is quite a lot of it. When it comes to a Mythic Plus environment, again, don't read too much into the class tree as it is a bit more flexible, but I did want to shout out a couple talents that I've been using throughout my testing. The spec tree is what I was running just today and over the course of this weekend for Beta Mythic Plus, and I wanted to talk about the talents, how they've been working, what I've been flexing around in the class tree and what's been helpful, and really what I've enjoyed. From the class tree overall, I do think taking like the magic damage reduction is a must. I think the improved Mass Dispel when you're going into certain dungeons like Temple of the Jade Serpent has very frequent use out of Mass Dispel. Every single bursting week, you should always take improved Mass Dispel. It is well worth a talent point. These felt extraordinarily good. The Rhapsody Holy Nova, there's been some bugs and some issues with it lately of actually properly stacking. And obviously, it's just a gameplay polish issue that they have on hand. Words of the Pious, I did actually mess around a little bit with this because I was putting together more of like a Wheel and Woe build and trying to play off of Blaze of Light. But I don't know how far that's going to go depending on where Harsh Discipline and having to smite to force penance procs is going to go, if that would mean we would even take it. I think I dropped 1 point of Crystalline Reflection to go into Translucent Image and was messing around with it that way. There are a couple other options. There's going to be times in like Shadow Moon Burial Grounds where you're going to need like a Disease Dispel. There's going to be mobs that you could purge and like not good offensive. There's always going to be uses for these other talents. Just because you don't see them here does not mean that they are bad. Again, just to highlight some other talents. But interesting things. One of my viewers actually suggested I play around with Wheel and Woe, and I really, really fucking like it. The more that I played with it, part of it is due to Harsh Discipline almost guaranteeing me the 7 stacker all the time, but I really thoroughly enjoyed Wheel and Woe. The reason being is that by stacking up your powered shield by 35%, working with your set bonuses, it really continued to empower what makes Discipline good in a 5-man environment. It's that when you can find tanks to work with, to play with, that have pretty good self-healing, you always have an effective resource to be able to give them all the time. Holy Priest is very notable for being able to do gobs and gobs and gobs of single target healing all the time, but it's not always necessary for them to be able to provide that, and there's a big opportunity cost because they are casting that heal, casting that flash heal, instead of dealing more damage. With Discipline, you have your dot flow, you have cooldown type abilities like Shadow or Death, like Penance, like Mind Games, I guess, even though it kind of sucks, right? That will increase your damage, produce healing, all that fun stuff. So what you are able to do with something like Wheel and Woe is have flexibility where you always are receiving some kind of benefit, whether it's to your damage directly by buffing up Smite, or most commonly by buffing up your shields, which is saving your mana economy by providing more powerful shields to allow your tank to focus on healing themselves. I really love playing with Vengeance Demon Hunters, for what it's worth. That allows you breathing room to continue healing with Atonement, not having to cast Flash Heals or Renew, which cost a lot of mana, and then you can focus on your dots, you can focus on sniping those Shadow or Deaths, and you can focus on just what Disc Priest want to do in 5-mans, which is heal by dealing some damage. Felt wonderful. Speaking of applying Atonements, I almost never, like I mentioned, was using Flash Heal or Renew in 5-mans. A couple times it was an emergency and I had to use some Flash Heals, but most of the time, when I felt like I had good control of the healing, when I felt like I had a good setup with my cooldowns, Bright Pupil comes in clutch by constantly allowing AoE output, and since they had actually buffed Powered Radiance from that set of nerfs, it does feel like Radiance can put out a decent amount of healing to be able to properly support you, and that felt wonderful when I needed to be able to apply more atonements and start topping a lot of people off. Revel in Purity is unfortunately not properly working. There's a number of times where it will double apply to the same target and provide like a 26% duration instead of the 20 seconds that it usually does because of the pandemic effect that they have, which is very frustrating because with Throes of Pain, you do get a lot of mana regen, and I would say the plurality of your mana regen from dungeons should end up being Throes of Pain. So it got quite frustrating, but the general gameplay of what I was doing, and you'll see it in the clips and everything like that as follows, was multi-dotting very heavily and babysitting those dots to make sure that they are expiring with minimal duration to trigger Throes of Pain for mana regen, dumping shields into my tank constantly, and trying to keep shield on cooldown as long as it will relevantly absorb something. Wheel and Woe, I prioritized using it on shields, but when I encountered certain bosses that weren't really doing anything, it was satisfying to consume that smite buff, for smite to get some kind of reasonable damage increase as frequently as I could. I am constantly applying AoE atonements via Radiance, and I'm always taking Powered Life. Powered Life is a little bit more noticeable and not just pumping somebody up to full anymore after the health changes, but it does enough to get them out of that crisis situation. I've been messing around, and I'm not sure if I fully enjoy taking all these talents to support mind games, but when I was weaving in a lot more smites, thanks to Wheel and Woe, it was more noticeable having more mind games on hand, even though the ability does not hit nearly as hard as it used to be. Some of the hardest dungeons that we really had to encounter and deal with in particular were some dungeons which are just like blatantly overtuned, like Nakhood Offensive and Halls of Valor. At the moment, they're tuned to such an insane level that they're not really interesting or viable testing subjects that I would consider a good test of the spec. However, things like Shadow and Burial Ground were really quite good. Ruby Life Pools has been good. Temple of the Jade Serpent has been pretty interesting as well, even though I'm still learning through that dungeon once again. But I was actually overall quite pleased with how Disc has been able to perform and support its mana economy. Things like Algothar Academy have some extremely challenging bosses, which I love to be able to see, and there's areas where you do have to test yourself and do have to challenge yourself on setting yourself up on smoothing out damage patterns. Rapture is a wonderful tool to be able to set up, particularly for bosses, for stopping the damage in its tracks, giving you the breathing room to be able to top people off, and taking advantage of some extremely meaty shields in the process. Like I said, that's why I was playing with things like Words of the Pious to buff up like some of my smite damage, because I was finding that I was casting more smites, particularly when we started testing some tyrannical boss fights, or just started going into like higher level keys, that I was needing a bit more sustain out of my output. I would say some of the big strengths out of Disc are that it's defensives and its pain suppression, its barrier, its absorbs, the frequency with which you get those absorbs are extremely clutch. The ability to push people's health pools up further with things like Powered Life allow you to really think a lot more deeply about when you need to heal somebody, and should put more pressure on you to think about when it is that you need to first top somebody off, when it is that you need to apply shields to somebody, whether you need to heal them directly, and how that those decisions are going to save somebody's life or potentially ruin theirs. So I'm going to be really excited once I'm actually able to get all of the ability trackers and cooldown trackers and all the other weak cores that we're all used to having once we get into live servers. But Disc, when it came to a lot of the trash pulls, you're able to sustain your tanks very well. Once again, having the cooldown trackers to know the best time to pain sup, know the best time to be able to PI, to know the best time to set up some of these more dangerous pulls, felt very good. I am a bit concerned about the meta around M+ getting into very, very aggressive timing pulls. While we're kind of just like pulling a couple mobs at a time, hunky-dory, doing our thing, as there is going to be a lot of pressure for us to get into 18s, 19s, 20s quickly, to be able to get that extra loot and that extra value that will push you to have very, very aggressive and dangerous pulls where you pop all of your cooldowns and try to burst everything down before you get overwhelmed by kicks and it kills you. Some of these pulls, I think Disc performs well because of their absorb effects, because of their damage reduction effects, but they also don't really provide much in the way of like bursty group damage, which could be more of an assist. That said, that's like an extremely, extremely niche, like 0.1%er type setup, but it's something to see, especially as you start watching high key groups get going. With a lot of bosses being quite challenging for healing perspectives, Disc, I think, does really well. The concern is just how quickly you can burn through mana and how much you can actually sustain that output. But from a trash perspective, and even from like an affix perspective, I'm extremely pleased to see how Disc has been able to perform. There aren't too many slows, but I know Phantasm's going to have a lot of value in the raid. Even having lower cooldown on something like Fear if we get into like Spitefuls again. Technically, Void Tendrils could be another option to be able to deal with as well, to be able to have some extra utility tools on hand. I've messed around with Dominate Mind a little bit, and haven't seen any great results just yet from dungeons, just kind of grabbing something as a pet and having it do a bit of extra damage for me. Those things felt okay, but overall I'm really excited to see how Disc has been able to perform, and I'm really, really pleased that they made this independent variable for us to be able to work with. That said, the Mindbender, Inescapable Torment, all that other stuff on the right side of the tree is pretty much dead to me. Expiation could have a place if there's enough uses for Shadow or Death in a dungeon, but otherwise that Mindbender crap I don't even want to touch, I don't even want to deal with. The Atonement transfer rates are just bad, so in case you're curious as to why I omitted it from the video, that's basically why. I didn't leave out the Holy Priest friends just yet. I did want to go over everything very quickly as well. I did a little bit of testing, but I didn't get to flex into all the talent options that I wanted to, but I wanted to give you guys at least a quick heads up as to where I'm at. They did go with some overall nerfs, both to Holy Priest's damage and to their overall output. You can just see all these different modifiers across the board getting nerfed. Talents like Circle of Healing, Ripple, Divine Hymn, Divine Words, damage buff going from 50% to 30%. Sanctifies Sanctuary Field getting nerfed, and Imperial Blaze getting nerfed, Salve getting a little nerf. All across the board, just a number of nerfs to that overall output. That being said, though, when I got some opportunity to be able to test out Holy in a raid environment, I was not worried about its performance. It was still able to pump out tons and tons of healing without issue, and even when we started getting into an M+ environment as well, the damage was not some overwhelming large problem. And as we take a look at our footage, you can see that there was plenty of opportunity for Holy Priest to really shine. I didn't get a chance to have a ton of pulls as Holy in a number of these raid fights, but I was messing around with the idea of dropping things like Pontifex and Resonant Words, and instead flexing into more Prayer of Mending support talents, since you are going to be casting those anyway, and by taking more charges, and by taking the chance of, I think it's Say Your Prayers, of having your Prayer of Mendings not consume charges when they bounce, that they would also just make Benediction better, and they would just improve your overall output without having to change anything else around. I was pretty pleased with the results. I'd like to see if WoW Analyzer or some mathematician can break down what's going to fully math out better, but it definitely has me leaning more towards some of those Prayer of Mending talents after taking them, just because of how much support that they could provide and steady output they could provide without actually forcing you to cast anything additional. Holy also has tremendous opportunity in a raid environment to flex into additional damage if they need to. Even though they did nerf Holy Fire, they did nerf Imperial Blaze, all that other fun stuff, I do think that if there were encounters where you needed to have every healer contributing all this extra damage, or there were fights like Jaina where there was nothing going on in phase 1 and it was still requiring healers to deal lots of damage, then Holy would be in a wonderful spot for that. Overall, I'm more excited for Holy Priest in a raid than I think I've been in for a long time. I think the Lightweaver type build with a bit of Prayer of Mending support is probably trending towards the correct direction, the best way, the best practices, you name it. That being said, the bright side is that there's a lot of flexibility if I'm not right. The Prayer of Healing build I don't think is going to be as strong, but for those who are sick and tired of playing with Flash Concentration or Lightweaver, that build exists, that build is there, that build's not bad, and you can weave in lots of Prayer of Healing to be able to kind of get the job done as needed, to be able to pump output as needed, and to succeed. I did notice that Holy was kind of brought down pretty heavily from its damage in a 5-man environment, but it was also doing gobs and gobs more output than everybody else around it. So it's got brought down a little bit more to Earth, and you still have tremendous flexibility from Divine Word to damage or heal all the time, to the point that I think Divine Word's probably one of the best capstones we have. And it allows you to just be very useful no matter what is going on. So my hope and my hype and everything like that for Holy Priest is not overshadowed by Discipline. I'm very hyped and very hopeful for both of them, and I'm really excited for a lot of these bugs to get fixed. I'm really excited for this tuning to get smoothed out, and for us to just dive into some new content. All right, thank you so much for watching. I know this is a long one, and thank you for getting through it with me, guys. We are going to be back with our tier lists as well coming up this week. And any other ideas for videos, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.